Today we begin the holiest week in the year for us. And we begin to celebrate this Holy Week by reading Mark's version of Jesus' torture and murder. There are two images from Mark's account that I'd like you to consider this morning. These images will help us understand what Jesus' death means for us and for our world. They'll also reveal a connection between what we remember today and what happened yesterday at the March for Life. Mark tells us that Jesus, as he hung on the cross from noon until 3 p.m., it's a beautiful spring day when suddenly a darkness comes over the land. Mark tells us that all of a sudden at noon, the whole countryside is covered in a darkness. He doesn't say what it is. He doesn't say it's an eclipse. He's borrowing this image from chapter 8 of the prophet Amos. It's the dark cloud of God's judgment over all that was done to Jesus. On that day, when that cloud of judgment came, God said a definitive no to murder and violence. God said no to powerful governments justifying torture and the arrest of innocents. On that day, God said no to betrayal and cowardice. God said no to lies and to all the forces, all the evil forces that move us to do to others what was done to Jesus that day. On that day, God said a definitive no to death and evil itself. Well, our nation has seen the dark cloud of God's judgment come over it. Every time a child is shot, every time a gun is pulled in one of our schools and used in violence, the cloud of God's judgment comes over this country. Every time a political leader fails to protect our children and each of us, the dark judgment of God's cloud comes over this land. God is saying no to our violence and no to our indifference. Now here's what's amazing. It's the children who've watched their friends killed. It's the children who've come close to being killed that have woke up to the dark cloud of God's violence. Inspired by God's judgment over this land, they have begun to act. That's what we saw happen yesterday with the March for Life. As hundreds of thousands of children and teens and adults and the elderly poured into our cities because they were finally moved by God's judgment. When Jesus died on the cross, Mark tells us that on the other side of the city of Jerusalem, in the temple, the curtain was torn in two. The curtain that separates the priests and the Jews and the Gentiles from the Holy of Holies. The curtain that hangs and separates us from the absolute mystery of God was torn in two when Jesus died. Remember how Mark's gospel begins. Jesus comes out of the waters of the Jordan, and the heavens are torn, and out of the heavens pours the Spirit of God onto Jesus. Mark's gospel ends with the temple that separates all from God being torn in two, and the life of God now pouring onto us. The cross of Jesus contains the judgment of God and pours upon us the very life of God, Mark tells us. That life that pours out of the death and resurrection of Jesus pours onto us in our world, because God wants to create a new people and a new world where what was done to Jesus and so many of our children will not be done again. You see, Jesus' death is the decisive event in human history and in cosmic history. It is the event in which God says no to violence and death and evil, and at the same time pours out onto us through that torn curtain God's life and God's presence and God's power, so that a new world freed from violence can be created. Yesterday, you saw hundreds and thousands of people saying yes to the life that pours out of Jesus' death and resurrection. You saw hundreds and thousands of people saying yes to the new life that God gives us through Jesus' cross, standing up to the forces of violence, standing with victims. And all of us here today, we stand like the centurion, looking at the crucified Jesus in the presence of the cloud of judgment, but with the fabulous hope that the curtain has been torn, and pouring onto us and our world is God's new life. My friends, as we enter into Holy Week, I pray that we can see the cloud of God's judgment and be inspired by it, and that we can say a new, fresh yes to the life of God that comes pouring out onto us from the death and resurrection of Jesus.